or someone you wish you had fought harder for, or someone who fought hard for you, then please don't let this moment pass quietly. Leave a like on this video and tell me in the comments what it stirred up in you. Tell me about the phone call you answered or the one you wish you had. Tell me about the person who showed up when you needed them most, or the time you were the person who showed up. I read every comment, every single one. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please do. Because these stories are for all of us. And every time you subscribe, you tell me that it's worth continuing, which is the kind of signal I've learned never to take for granted. I want to leave you with something simple, because simple is the most honest thing I know. The night that Eleanor stood up at that Christmas table and told me I was no longer part of this family, she was a woman in tremendous pain, doing the only thing she could think of to protect herself from a man who had convinced her, slowly and skillfully, that she deserved the life he was giving her. She was wrong about me, but she was not wrong about needing to do something drastic. She just needed the drastic thing to be pointed in a different direction. And the phone call that changed everything in that room? It was a call I had been ready to answer for 31 years. Be the person who keeps the line open. Be the person who answers in the dark. Be the person who shows up on a wet porch in December and knocks 3 steady times and waits. That is the whole of it. That is everything. Or someone you wish you had fought harder for, or someone who fought hard for you, then please don't let this moment pass quietly. Leave a like on this video and tell me in the comments what it stirred up in you. Tell me about the phone call you answered or the one you wish you had. Tell me about the person who showed up when you needed them most, or the time you were the person who showed up. I read every comment, every single one. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please do. Because these stories are for all of us. And every time you subscribe, you tell me that it's worth continuing, which is the kind of signal I've learned never to take for granted. I want to leave you with something simple, because simple is the most honest thing I know. The night that Eleanor stood up at that Christmas table and told me I was no longer part of this family, she was a woman in tremendous pain, doing the only thing she could think of to protect herself from a man who had convinced her, slowly and skillfully, that she deserved the life he was giving her. She was wrong about me, but she was not wrong about needing to do something drastic. She just needed the drastic thing to be pointed in a different direction. And the phone call that changed everything in that room? It was a call I had been ready to answer for 31 years. Be the person who keeps the line open. Be the person who answers in the dark. Be the person who shows up on a wet porch in December and knocks 3 steady times and waits. That is the whole of it. That is everything. I remember the exact moment I understood that silence could break a person just as completely as any word ever could. It was Christmas Eve. The kind of night that used to mean something to me. The smell of pine needles and butter melting over green beans, the sound of children arguing over who got to put the angel on top of the tree, the particular quality of light that only exists in a house full of people who are supposed to love each other. I was sitting at the far end of a long table I had helped pay for, in a house I had helped build in a way that no mortgage document would ever acknowledge. And my daughter, my Eleanor, 37 years old, the girl I had held in a hospital room while her mother cried the most beautiful tears I have ever seen, stood up from her chair, smoothed the front of her green dress, and looked directly at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not anger, something colder than that. "Dad," she said, and her voice was so steady it frightened me more than shouting ever could have. "I think we need to be honest tonight, with everyone here." She paused, and the whole table went quiet. 12 people, 4 generations, every fork set down, every glass stopped halfway to every mouth. "You are not part of this family anymore. You haven't been for a long time. And honestly," she let that word hang there like smoke, "we'd all be happier without you sitting at this table." My grandson Cody, who was 7 and sitting 2 seats away from me, looked up at his mother with wide eyes, then back at me, then at his plate of mashed potatoes, as if the answer to what was happening might be found somewhere in the gravy. I felt my hands go still. I am not a man who trembles often. 51 years of living will teach you a certain relationship with shock. You learn to let it move through you rather than knock you down. But I will not pretend that something didn't crack in my chest in that moment. Something small and structural, the kind of fracture you don't feel right away, but that changes how you carry weight afterward. I did not shout. I did not stand up. I did not ask her to explain herself in front of her husband's family and the new friends she had invited and the two teenagers checking their phones at the children's end of the table. I looked at her for what felt like a very long time, and then my phone rang. If you've ever sat in a room where someone just told you that you don't belong there, if you've ever felt that particular kind of cold that has nothing to do with the temperature, then you already understand something of what I'm going to tell you tonight. Stay with me until the end of this story. Every word of it is true, and every word of it earned its way into being. If it touches something in you, leave me a like. Tell me about it in the comments. I read every single one, and subscribe to this channel, because stories like this one deserve to be heard. I believe that, with everything I have. Now let me take you back, because that phone call did not come from nowhere, and neither did that night. My name is Robert Calloway. I go by Bobby to people who've known me long enough to earn the shorter version, and to be honest, not that many people have these days. I am 63 years old. I live in Harlan, Kentucky, not the city proper, but the edge of it, where the road starts to think it might become a gravel path and then changes its mind. I retired 4 years ago from 31 years of service as a U.S. Army Signal Corps officer, finishing as a Master Sergeant, which is the kind of rank that doesn't come with a ceremony, but comes with a very precise understanding of how communication systems fail, how people fail, and how to remain functional when both things happen at the same time. After the Army, I drove long haul for a freight company out of Lexington for 7 years, and then I worked as a private security communications consultant for another 9. I am telling you all this not to brag. I have never been particularly comfortable with bragging, but because it matters to what comes later. It always matters who a person is before the story you're about to tell them actually starts. My wife, Patricia, died 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. She was the kind of woman who made every room feel like it had better acoustics. Warmer, clearer, easier to hear people in. When she died, I didn't know what to do with the house, so I stayed in it. I didn't know what to do with the holidays, so I kept showing up to them. I didn't know what to do with myself, so I became quiet. Quieter than I should have been. Quieter than was probably fair to the people around me. Eleanor is our only child. She was 26 when Patricia died, already living in Pineville, about 40 minutes from Harlan, already working as a dental hygienist, already building a life that didn't need me at its center, which was exactly how I had raised her to be. Independent, capable, not the kind of person who waits for someone else to hand them their next chapter. I was proud of that. I'm still proud of that. She met Marcus 3 years after her mother passed. Marcus Beaumont. He came from money, not old money, but the kind of newer money that works very hard to look like old money, which is a whole different thing and a whole different kind of trouble. His father owned 4 car dealerships across 3 counties, and Marcus himself was in commercial real estate, which meant he spent a great deal of time in very nice shoes explaining to people why the building they were about to buy was worth more than the number on the paper suggested. He was handsome in the specific way that used to be called a real operator. Tall, well-kept, the kind of man who looks you directly in the eye when he shakes your hand and says your name back to you immediately after you say it, as if he's been waiting all his life to finally meet you specifically. I genuinely tried to like him. I want to be honest about that because this is not a story about me being the suspicious father who never gave the new man a chance. I tried. Eleanor was happy. Or she looked happy, which I took for the same thing, because I was a man with 11 years of widowhood behind him and not enough practice at reading the difference between someone who is happy and someone who is working very hard at appearing to be. I grilled steaks with Marcus in my backyard. I let him drive my truck once, which I do not let people do. I listened to his opinions about football and college basketball and the state of the economy, and I nodded, and I asked follow-up questions, and I put real effort into the space between us. But there was a moment, I can still feel the exact quality of the August afternoon when it happened, at a family cookout, maybe 4 months after I first met him, when Marcus looked at me from across the picnic table and said, in that easy voice of his, with that easy smile that never quite reached both eyes at the same time, "Bobby, for a retired soldier, you sure do seem comfortable just kind of fading into the background, don't you?" And then he laughed, and two of his friends who were standing nearby laughed, and Eleanor, who was carrying a bowl of coleslaw from the kitchen, laughed too, without having heard the whole sentence. I looked at him for a moment. "Yeah," I said, "I've always found that useful." He laughed again. But something in the way he laughed told me he didn't fully understand what I'd said. And something in the way I'd said it told a much quieter part of me that I should start paying closer attention to Marcus Beaumont. The years that followed were a series of small pictures, each one slightly darker than the one before, assembled into something that only made its true shape visible once you stepped all the way back from it. There was the Thanksgiving, Eleanor's first Thanksgiving in the house on Crestwood Drive that Marcus had picked out and whose mortgage Marcus had decided upon without consulting her, though she had been the one to repaint every room in it and plant flowers along the front walk that came back every April with a stubbornness that I always thought resembled her. That Thanksgiving, Marcus corrected Eleanor 3 times at the dinner table. Once about a recipe that had been her mother's. Once about which year a mutual friend had gotten married. Once about whether she'd remembered to call the plumber before the weekend. And when she said she had, he said she hadn't. And she went quiet in a way that was not the quiet of someone who has been proven wrong, but the quiet of someone who has learned that arguing about small things is not worth the cost. I noticed the way her shoulders changed shape when he spoke to her in that particular tone. I noticed, and I said nothing, and I have not fully forgiven myself for that. There was the Christmas 2 years in. Cody had just turned 1, and Eleanor had brought him to my house for the holiday. And Marcus had come separately, saying he'd been held up with something for work, arriving 3 hours after he'd said he would, smelling of a specific kind of expensive whiskey, cheerful and slightly too loud. And when Cody fussed during dinner, Marcus said to Eleanor in front of me, "Can you not manage that?" 2 short words in the middle of them, manage that, as if their infant son were an administrative problem she had failed to handle efficiently. Eleanor picked Cody up without a word and took him to the back bedroom, and I sat across the table from Marcus, and he poured himself more wine and said, "She gets sensitive about the baby stuff," in a tone that suggested this was a personal failing rather than a natural human response. I said, "She's a wonderful mother." He said, "Sure." That single syllable told me more than any conversation we had ever had. There was a Saturday afternoon in late March when Eleanor stopped by my house to drop off some tax documents I'd asked her to help me file. Marcus wasn't with her. She sat at my kitchen table while I made coffee, and she was wearing a light cardigan, and when she reached across the table to pull a folder toward her, the sleeve slid up, and I saw a bruise on her forearm. Oval, faded to yellow at the edges, which meant it was maybe a week old. The shape of it was specific enough that I knew what had made it without asking. I poured the coffee. I set a cup in front of her. I sat down. "Eleanor," I said. "I fell," she said, without looking up from the folder. "Okay," I said. She finally looked up. Her eyes were steady and clear and very tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "Dad, don't." "I'm not doing anything," I said. "Please," she said. Very quietly, "Please don't." I looked at my coffee. I looked at her. And then I said the most insufficient thing a parent can say in that moment. I said, "I'm here, Eleanor. Whatever you need." Which is true and loving and entirely useless when someone has already convinced themselves that asking for help is a worse option than enduring whatever is happening to them. She nodded. She drank her coffee. We talked about the tax documents. She drove away, and I stood in my driveway for 20 minutes in the March cold, and I made myself remember, the way I had trained myself in the army to remember specific information under pressure, every small thing I had seen and heard over the past 2 years. I assembled it carefully, the way you assemble a communication system that has to work when everything around it is failing. And then I waited, because I had learned, in 31 years, that the right moment to act is almost never the moment you most want to act. Patience is not passivity. It is the discipline to choose your position before you choose your movement. I did not wait as long as I should have, and I did not wait as long as I feared I would have to. 3 weeks after that afternoon in my kitchen on a Thursday night at 8:45 in the evening, my phone rang. The screen said it was Eleanor, but when I answered, the first thing I heard was not her voice. The first thing I heard was Marcus in the background, raised and sharp, saying something I could not make out. And then I heard Eleanor's voice, not speaking to me but speaking to him, saying, "Marcus, stop, just—" And then the line went quiet for a moment, and then Eleanor said very clearly, not loudly but with the specific clarity of someone who is speaking carefully, "Dad, I was just calling to say good night." I understood immediately. She had said good night, but it was 8:45 on a Thursday. We had not spoken earlier that day. We had no arrangement to speak that evening. She had called me Dad 3 times in the last week instead of Daddy, which was the word she had used for me since she was old enough to form the syllables, and which she had never entirely stopped using, even at 37. I had told her, years ago, after Patricia died, when Eleanor was going through her own version of grief and was also leaving a relationship with a man I had found concerning, a different man, a man before Marcus. I had told her that if she ever needed me, and couldn't say so directly, she could call me and say those exact words. I was just calling to say good night. 3 syllables of that particular kind. We had never used it before. We had hoped we never would. I sat very still for exactly 4 seconds. I have counted them back many times. In those 4 seconds, something happened in my body that I have tried to describe to people and have never quite managed to describe accurately. It was not panic. Panic is loud and scattered. This was the opposite. It was a narrowing, the way a beam of light narrows when you focus a lens, becoming smaller and brighter and more precise until it will burn through whatever it touches. "All right, sweetheart," I said. "Sleep well." I hung up. I already knew what I was going to do. I put on my boots. I did not rush, because rushing is what you do when you haven't thought things through. I put on my jacket. I went to the small cabinet in my hallway where I keep a locked box with some of the things a man in my situation keeps: a personal alarm, a small flashlight that can also be used as a striking instrument, a folded piece of paper with relevant local contacts. I called Pineville PD on my way out the door, not because I needed them to act before I got there, but because I wanted them informed and in position, and because I have learned in more situations than I care to count that the most dangerous mistake a person can make in a crisis is to become the only person who knows the crisis is happening. I told the dispatcher, a woman who sounded young and serious and good at her job, that I had reason to believe my daughter was in danger at her residence on Crestwood Drive, that I was en route, and that I would appreciate a unit being dispatched at a pace consistent with a domestic disturbance that had not yet reached a breaking point, but that I assessed as likely to do so. I gave her my name, my age, my relationship to the address, and my ETA. She said, "Sir, are you sure she's in danger? Is this confirmed?" I said, "It is confirmed to my satisfaction, yes." She paused for exactly 1 beat. "Units will be there in approximately 9 minutes. I'll be there in 7, I said. I will be the one standing on the front porch. The drive from my house to Crestwood Drive takes 11 minutes in normal conditions. That night, in December, with a light freezing drizzle coming down and the roads doing what roads in eastern Kentucky do when they get cold and wet, I made it in 8. I noticed the rain the way you notice background noise in a recording you're trying to decipher. Present, registered, inconsequential. I parked at the end of the block. I walked to the front door. From inside the house I could hear Marcus's voice, not individual words but the shape of his voice. Sharp, repetitive, the cadence of someone making the same point over and over with increasing force, which is a pattern that never ends anywhere good. A light was on in the kitchen window. The Christmas wreath Eleanor had hung on the front door had a red bow on it that was slightly crooked. I knocked. Not with urgency. 3 steady knocks. The noise inside stopped. The door opened. Marcus stood there in slacks and a dress shirt with the top button undone, and he looked at me with the expression of a man who had not expected company and did not want it. And there was something disheveled about him in a way I had not seen before. A particular tightness around the jaw, and a redness in the face that was not embarrassment but something harder and hotter. "Bobby," he said, "it's late." "It is," I agreed. "Is Eleanor here?" He started to say something. I could see him constructing an answer, and then Eleanor appeared behind him in the hallway, and I looked at her, and she looked at me, and the expression on her face was relief and shame in equal measure, which is one of the most painful combinations of emotions a person can show another person without saying a word. "Dad," she said. "Hey, sweetheart," I said, very normally. Why don't you come stand over here with me for a minute? Marcus turned to look at her and then back at me, and I could see him deciding how to play the next few seconds. He was a smart man. He knew that whatever authority he had in that hallway had just been disrupted by the presence of another person, and he was calculating his options. "There's no issue here," he said to me. "We were just having a disagreement." "I know," I said. "That's why I'm standing on the porch instead of coming inside." I said it quietly. I said it without hostility. I did not raise my voice because raising your voice in a situation like that is a gift to the person who wants to destabilize you. It hands them the narrative. I simply stood on the porch in the freezing drizzle and looked at Marcus Beaumont with the particular quality of attention I had spent 31 years learning to deploy, which is the attention of someone who has assessed a situation, found it manageable, and is choosing to wait rather than escalate, because waiting is the more powerful option. Marcus held my gaze for about 5 seconds. Then, something in his posture changed. Very slightly, almost imperceptibly, the way a structure changes in the seconds before it gives way. Eleanor came to the door. She stepped onto the porch next to me, and I put my arm around her shoulders without comment, and we stood there together in the wet December air. And behind us the street was very quiet and very dark. 2 minutes later, the first police cruiser turned onto Crestwood Drive with its lights off, exactly as I had quietly suggested to the dispatcher. The officers were professional and thorough. They spoke separately to Eleanor, to Marcus, and to me. Eleanor told them enough. Not everything, not yet, but enough. There was a small laceration above her left eyebrow, partially hidden by her hair, that the officer noted in his report without asking her to explain it. Marcus was asked to step outside, and then he was asked to step farther outside, and then he was asked to come with them, which he did, reluctantly, loudly, and with the specific kind of indignation that people perform when they have run out of more sophisticated tools. One of the officers, a man about 15 years younger than me, looked at me after Marcus had been escorted to the second cruiser, and he said, "You said on the dispatch that you were former Signal Corps. That right?" "That's right," I said. "My uncle was a comms specialist, 25th Infantry," he said. "He said the hardest thing he ever learned was how to stay calm when the lines go down." He looked at me steadily. "Looks like you learned it." 31 years is a long time to practice," I said. He nodded. "Your daughter's lucky to have you." I looked at Eleanor, who was sitting on the front step, wrapped in a blanket an officer had produced, talking in a low voice to a female deputy and holding her own hands very tightly in her lap. She looked young. She looked tired. She looked, at that moment, exactly the way she had looked in the hospital the night she was born, new to something enormous, not fully certain how to hold the weight of it. "No," I said. "I'm the lucky one." The quiet that came after Marcus was taken away and the cruisers had gone had a texture to it. The specific weight of a house that has been very loud for a long time finally going still. Eleanor and I sat in her kitchen, the Christmas decorations still up, the little ceramic nativity set her mother had given her on their mantel shelf, and she looked at her hands, and then she looked at me. "I'm sorry," she said. "You have nothing to apologize for," I said. "I should have told you sooner." "Maybe," I said. "But you're telling me now, and I'm here now. That's what matters." She shook her head, and I could see her trying to hold herself together, which she had been doing for so long that the effort of it had become invisible to her. She had stopped being able to tell where the effort ended and where she began. "I made you feel like you weren't part of the family," she said. "I said those things to you at Christmas dinner, and I—" "Eleanor," I said, and I waited until she looked at me. "You were protecting yourself. People in pain protect themselves in whatever directions they can. I'm not angry." "You should be." "I'm not," I said. "I'm just glad I picked up the phone." She cried then, and I let her, and I made tea, and we sat in her kitchen until almost 3 a.m. talking about things we should have talked about years earlier, about her mother, about the distance that had grown between us, about the ways that grief, when it goes unexpressed, hardens into behavior that looks like coldness from the outside, even when it's anything but. I told her things about her mother that she had never known. She told me things about the last 3 years that I had suspected but had not been certain of. And hearing them spoken aloud in her plain, exhausted voice was both worse and better than suspecting them had been. Worse because the details made it real. Better because reality, however painful, is always a better foundation than fear. We did not solve everything that night. We did not pretend we had. But when I left her house at 3:30 in the morning, walking to my truck in the cold December air, I felt something I had not felt in 11 years, since the night Patricia died. I felt needed in a way that was specific and real and earned, not needed as a habit or an obligation. Needed as myself. As Robert Calloway, 63 years old, Master Sergeant retired, father, widower, a man who had spent 31 years learning how to keep communications open when everything was working against him. The weeks that followed were full and difficult in the way that doing necessary things is always full and difficult, not because the things themselves are complicated, but because they require a willingness to stay present even when presence is uncomfortable. Eleanor found a lawyer within 4 days. Her name was Sandra Okafor, and she had a small office above a hardware store in Pineville and a reputation in the county for taking domestic violence cases and not losing them, which is the only kind of reputation that matters in that specific line of work. I drove Eleanor to her first appointment, and I waited in the waiting room with its stack of outdated magazines and its single plant that was trying its best, and when Eleanor came out 45 minutes later, she looked lighter in some structural way, as if a few pounds of something had been redistributed. "She thinks we have enough," Eleanor said. "Good," I said. "She wants to talk to you too. About what you saw, what you heard over the years." "Tell her I'll be there whenever she needs me," I said. "I kept notes." Eleanor stopped walking. She looked at me. "You kept notes?" "Since the summer about 18 months ago," I said. "Dates, times, what was said, what I observed. Photographs when I had the opportunity. It's not surveillance. It's what you do when you understand something is being built that will eventually need to be dismantled." She stared at me for a long moment, and then something happened on her face that I don't have a precise word for. It was not quite a laugh and not quite a cry, but somewhere in the territory between them, a sound that acknowledged the absurdity and the pain and the love all at once. "You're unbelievable, Dad," she said, not unkindly, not even close to unkindly. "I'm thorough," I said. "It's different." The formal proceedings began in February. I will not catalog every detail of them, because the details that matter to this story are the ones that carry meaning rather than the ones that carry procedural complexity. What I will tell you is that on a Thursday morning in late March, I sat in a courtroom in Bell County with Eleanor on one side of me and Sandra Okafor on the other, and Marcus Beaumont sat across the room in a suit that had probably cost more than my first car, and when it was my turn to speak, I stood up, and I spoke clearly and without heat into that small, wood-paneled room. I told them what I had seen. I told them what I had heard. I told them about the bruise on Eleanor's forearm on a March afternoon in my kitchen, and the way her shoulders changed shape when certain words were spoken to her, and the pattern I had recognized, because pattern recognition in a degraded communications environment is something I had been specifically trained to do and then had spent 40 years practicing. The pattern I had recognized long before I had the evidence to name it properly. The judge was a woman in her 60s with reading glasses pushed up on her head, and a manner that suggested she had sat in this particular chair for a long time and had very little patience for anything that was not the truth. She looked at me over her glasses after I finished speaking, and she said, "Master Sergeant Calloway, do you hold any personal animosity toward the respondent in this matter?" I considered the question honestly, which is what it deserved. "I don't hate him," I said. "I hate what he chose to do inside what should have been a safe place. Those are different things, and I think the court is best served by keeping them separate." She looked at me for a moment. "They usually are," she said, and she made a note. Marcus spoke during his testimony with the careful precision of a man who had been coached, but there is a particular kind of pressure that a courtroom applies to coached language, and after about 20 minutes of it, you could see the coaching beginning to show through the performance the way old paint shows through new paint when the weather changes. His attorney was good. His case, under Sandra Okafor's careful cross-examination, was not. The protective order was issued that afternoon. The divorce proceedings were begun that same week. The agreement that was eventually reached, property, custody of Cody, financial arrangements, took 4 months more and was contested at every step by a man who had discovered, too late, That what he had mistaken for weakness in Eleanor and what he had mistaken for irrelevance in me were neither of those things. When it was over, when the last paper was signed and the last motion was filed, and Sandra Okafor called Eleanor to say that it was finished, I was at my house, in my kitchen, making the same kind of plain supper I had been making for myself since Patricia died. A pork chop, some green beans, a piece of bread. I heard Eleanor's car pull into my driveway, and I went to the door, and she came in, and she sat at my kitchen table, and she said, "It's done, Dad." And I put a plate in front of her and said, "Then eat something." She laughed. It was a real laugh, unguarded and clear, the laugh she had had as a teenager when something caught her genuinely off guard. And it filled my kitchen the way a good radio signal fills a room, cleanly, completely, without static. Summer came in the way it always does in eastern Kentucky, all at once and without apology. The hills going green so quickly it almost looks like movement, the air turning thick and useful and alive with sound. Eleanor and Cody moved into a rental house about 6 blocks from a good elementary school, a 2-bedroom with a yard that had a maple tree in it that Cody immediately adopted as his primary project. Every time I came to visit, which was 2 or 3 times a week, he had discovered something new about that tree, a new bug living in the bark, a branch that was exactly the right height for something, a section where the roots came above the ground in a shape he insisted looked like a sleeping dog. He was a serious, thoughtful boy who looked like Eleanor but laughed like his grandfather, which I have decided is one of the better compliments I have ever received, even though I had nothing to do with it. Eleanor was different in ways that were difficult to describe but easy to see. She went back to working full-time, and the dental practice she worked at gave her a caseload she seemed genuinely engaged by. She signed up for a continuing education course on Thursday evenings, something to do with pediatric dental care, and I babysat Cody those nights, which we both pretended was a favor to her, and both understood was as much a gift to me as it was to either of them. She started running in the mornings, short distances at first, and then longer ones, and when I asked her once why she had taken it up, she said, "I like being somewhere I can hear myself think, just my feet and the road and nobody else's voice." I understood that completely. I was changing too, though I noticed it more in the observations of others than in myself. My neighbor Patsy, who is 71 and has lived 3 houses down from me since the late 80s, and who has never in 30 years failed to have an opinion she was willing to share about anything, knocked on my door one Saturday morning with a loaf of zucchini bread and looked at me when I answered and said, "Bobby Calloway, you seem lighter lately. Did you lose weight?" "I don't think so," I said. "Well, something's different," she said. "You were starting to look like a man who'd stopped expecting things to get better. Now you don't." I took the zucchini bread. "Thank you, Patsy," I said. "It's not a compliment," she said. "It's an observation." But she was smiling when she said it, and I was smiling too. And I ate that zucchini bread over the next 2 days and found it to be one of the better things I had eaten in a long time. I rejoined the American Legion post in town, which I had drifted away from after Patricia died. I started going to the Thursday evening meetings again, and the men there were mostly older than me and had accumulated between them a very impressive collection of the specific kind of humor that develops in people who have been in serious situations and have subsequently decided that life is too short for anything but plain speaking and good coffee. I found myself looking forward to those meetings in a way I had not looked forward to things for years, not because anything momentous happened in them, but because they were consistent and real and full of people who understood, without needing to explain it, that silence is a language too. One afternoon in late August, Cody and I were sitting under his maple tree in the backyard. He was eating an apple and examining a piece of bark, and I was sitting in a lawn chair that Eleanor had bought specifically for my visits, and Cody looked up at me with the direct, unfiltered quality of attention that 7-year-olds apply to things that genuinely interest them. "Grandpa," he said, "why did Daddy have to go away?" I had been expecting the question. I had thought about it a fair amount, the way I think about most things that require careful handling, deliberately, in advance, without assuming I knew exactly what form it would take when it arrived. "Well," I said, "your daddy was having a really hard time for a while. He was making choices that were hurting your mom and hurting you, and when you hurt people you love, or people who love you, it means something has to change." Cody chewed his apple. "Did he know he was hurting her?" "I think so," I said. "I think he knew, and that made it worse, not better." Cody considered this with the gravity it deserved. Does he miss us? I don't know for certain, I said honestly, but I think he probably does. Missing people is easy. The hard part is being the kind of person they don't have to be afraid of. Cody looked at the piece of bark. Then he looked at me. Were you ever afraid, Grandpa? Yes, I said. Of what? Of not being there when you needed me, I said. Of the phone ringing too late. He nodded as if this was a completely sensible fear, which in his experience it probably was. Then he held up the piece of bark and said, I think there might be a beetle inside this. And the conversation shifted, as conversations with 7-year-olds do, into territory that was arguably more immediately important than anything we had been discussing. October came cool and early that year, the leaves on the hills turning fast and gold and slightly reckless, the way fall in Kentucky has of reminding you that beauty and ending are not as different as you sometimes want them to be. A letter arrived for Eleanor. Paper, handwritten, the address in a careful, controlled script that I recognized from years of Christmas cards and birthday notes. Marcus had gotten our attorney's address from his own attorney and had the letter forwarded through the proper channels. Eleanor called me when it arrived, before she had opened it. It's from him, she said. Do you want me to come over? I asked. No, she said. I want to read it first. Then maybe. She called me back 40 minutes later. He says he's in a program, she said. Anger management and counseling. He says he's not asking for anything. He says he just wanted to say he knows what he did and he's sorry. I was quiet for a moment. How does it feel to read that? She was quiet too. Then she said, It feels like something I needed to hear. It doesn't change anything. But it feels like I needed to know that he knew. Does that make sense? It makes complete sense, I said. Do you think he means it? I think that's a question that doesn't have an answer yet, I said. And I think that's okay. You don't have to decide anything about it right now. You can just let it be what it is. A letter from a man you used to be married to, saying something that was overdue. Do you forgive him? She asked. I thought about that question for a while, looking out my kitchen window at the October hills. I'm not there yet, I said. But I'm not in a hurry in either direction. I'm just here, keeping things in order, paying attention. That's enough for me right now. She said, I love you, Dad. I love you too, Eleanor, I said. Get some sleep. Christmas came back. It comes back every year without asking permission, which is one of the things I have always respected about it. Eleanor organized a dinner at her new house. Smaller than the year before, deliberately smaller, the size of a gathering that actually fits the people in it, rather than the idea of what a holiday is supposed to look like. There was her friend Dana and her husband Tom, who had been quietly supportive throughout the whole year in the way that good friends are supportive, present without making it about themselves. There was my friend Earl from the Legion Post, a widower like me, who I had invited because Earl makes everyone around him feel like the room is better for his presence, and because Eleanor had told me to bring someone. There was Cody, electric with anticipation, dressed in a sweater with a reindeer on it that he had picked out himself and was very proud of. There was me. And there was Eleanor in her kitchen, making a turkey and her mother's green bean recipe and a pie that came out slightly too brown on one edge and perfect everywhere else. And when I offered to help, she handed me a towel and said, You can dry dishes. And I stood beside her at the sink and dried every dish she handed me. And we talked about small things. And the radio was playing something quiet and seasonal. And Cody came in and out asking questions about when dinner would be ready and whether he could have a piece of pie before the meal. And Eleanor said no. And he went back out. And we stood there in that warm kitchen in the December evening, and it was simply good. The word good is not large enough for what I mean, but it is the only accurate one. It was earned and simple and real, and the table we sat at was exactly the right size. After dinner, after Cody had negotiated successfully for 2 pieces of pie and was sitting on the floor with a book, Earl leaned over to me and said quietly, Your daughter is a remarkable woman, Bobby. She is, I said. Takes after her father, he said. No, I said. She takes after her mother. I just tried to get out of the way at the right moments. He laughed, and I laughed, and Cody looked up from his book and asked what was funny, and we told him nothing, and he went back to his book, and the lights on the little Christmas tree in the corner of the room reflected off the window glass and doubled, so that the room looked, for a moment, like it contained twice as many lights as it actually did. I have spent the better part of this year trying to understand what I want to carry forward from everything that happened and what I want to set down. This is what I have arrived at. I was not a perfect father. I was absent in ways I could not have named while they were happening. Absorbed by work, then absorbed by grief, then absorbed by the long quiet of a man who has lost the person who knew how to translate the world for him. I left gaps in Eleanor's life that a better kind of man would have filled more deliberately, and some of those gaps were the exact shapes that someone like Marcus could fit himself into, offering certainty where she needed it, offering attention where she was hungry for it, offering all the performances of care without the substance. That is something I have to live with. I do not say it for sympathy. I say it because it is true, and because I think that truth, spoken plainly, is the only thing that actually helps anyone. What I also know is this, that I was there, in the end, when the phone rang, that I had never stopped paying attention, that the code we had agreed upon years earlier, a small, quiet thing, a few words, held, because trust is not lost the way money is lost, all at once in a visible catastrophe. Trust is lost the way signal degrades, slowly, in fractions, until you realize one day that what you're hearing is mostly noise. And keeping trust means maintaining the line, even in the years when neither of you needs to use it. Eleanor needed that line. I had kept it open. That was enough. Strength is not the dramatic things. It is not the moment on the porch in the freezing December rain, though that was real, and I will not pretend otherwise. Strength is the 30 years of staying in shape, not for vanity, but because you understand at some point that your body is a tool, and tools require maintenance. Strength is the notes kept in a drawer, not out of paranoia, but out of the same trained instinct that tells you to document everything because clarity is always more useful than confusion. Strength is answering the phone. Strength is the patience to wait for the right moment and the willingness to recognize it when it arrives. Strength is sitting at a kitchen table at 3 a.m. making tea for a person you love and saying almost nothing and having that almost nothing be exactly what was needed. I am 63 years old. I live on the edge of Harlan, Kentucky, where the road thinks about becoming a gravel path and then decides against it. I eat plain suppers and attend Legion meetings on Thursdays and drive 40 minutes to Pineville on Tuesday afternoons to watch my grandson examine bark and mud and leaves with the same seriousness a general brings to a map. I am a man who kept a line open for 37 years, and when the call finally came, I was there to receive it. That is not a heroic story, it is just a father's story. But I think those are the same thing more often than anyone gives them credit for. If this story touched something in you tonight, if it reminded you of someone you love,